It had been years, more than I cared to count. Life had a funny way of sweeping you away, leaving behind the places and faces you once held dear. But when the chance came to return, I couldn't resist. I had been living in the city for so long, drowned in noise, people, and endless chaos, that I had forgotten the stillness of my hometown. That small town tucked away in the rolling hills, where everything seemed simpler. I hadn't been there since I was a child. My memories were distant, fragmented, and faded, like old photographs tucked away in a dusty box. But I still remembered the place, the way the sun would spill over the landscape in the mornings, casting long shadows on the narrow, winding streets, the scent of fresh pine in the air, the sound of children playing outside, and the way the small old houses seemed to whisper stories from the past. My journey began as I set off in my Toyota Camry, a mix of nostalgia and excitement filling the air. It went smoothly for the most part. The road began to narrow as I got closer to the town. It wasn't unusual. Small towns were often connected by stretches of winding, isolated roads. But this one, it was different. It felt vaguely familiar, like a dream I'd had before but couldn't quite remember. The trees lining the road seemed taller, denser, their shadows stretching long across the pavement as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The chirping of birds had faded, replaced by an unsettling quiet that hung in the air like a heavy fog. I glanced at the GPS. No signal. Typical for rural areas, I thought. But it was fine. I remembered this road. At least I thought I did. The further I drove, the quieter it got. I hadn't seen another car in what felt like miles. The hum of the engine was the only sound breaking the silence, and even that seemed muted. The road, once smooth and paved, became uneven, riddled with cracks and patches of gravel. There was something about this stretch of road that tugged at my memory. I couldn't quite place it, but it felt like I'd been here before. Long ago, maybe as a child, sitting in the back seat of my dad's old car, watching the trees blur past the window. But back then, it hadn't felt so lonely. I rolled down the window, hoping to catch a breeze or the sound of something, anything, that would break the eerie stillness. Instead, the air that greeted me was heavy, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and something else, something faintly metallic. It was probably nothing, or at least that's what I told myself. As I continued down the road, I noticed the sun beginning to set, casting an orange hue over the landscape. The isolation should have felt peaceful, a break from the city's constant noise, but instead, it felt off. No houses, no signs, not even an old gas station, just mile after mile of road, lined by trees that seemed to grow closer and closer together. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I'd glance in the rearview mirror. Nothing but the empty road behind me, stretching endlessly into the distance. Still, that weird sensation persisted. A faint prickling at the back of my neck, like unseen eyes were following my every move. I laughed it off, shaking my head. "It's just your imagination," I muttered. "You're letting the isolation get to you." But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Eventually, I spotted something up ahead, a familiar marker, a crooked old signpost at the side of the road. The paint was faded, the letters barely legible, but I recognized it. It was the marker for the turnoff to the town. Excitement bubbled up in my chest, pushing away the unease that had been creeping in. I was almost there, just a little further, and I'd be back in the place I'd always thought of as home. I turned onto the narrow road leading into town, the car bumping along the uneven surface. The trees here were even thicker, their branches arching overhead like a tunnel. The sunlight barely reached through the canopy, casting strange, shifting shadows on the ground. As I drove deeper into the tunnel of trees, I realized just how alone I was. Not a single car had passed me. Not a single sound broke the silence. I should have felt uneasy. I should have turned back. But I didn't, because this was home, and nothing bad could happen in the place you called home, right? The road kept winding, the fog growing thicker with each passing mile. It clung to the ground like a ghostly blanket, swirling in the car's headlights. The air felt heavier now, colder, pressing in on all sides as if the forest itself was closing in. And then I came to a crossroads. I slowed to a stop, my tires crunching against the uneven gravel as I pulled up to the intersection. Two paths lay ahead, splitting off in slightly different directions. Both looked similar at first glance, narrow stretches of cracked asphalt lined by dense trees. But as I sat there, staring out into the fog, I noticed one small difference. One path seemed clearer. The fog wasn't as thick, and I could see farther down it. It ran straighter, while the other seemed to curve and disappear into the haze almost immediately. I frowned, gripping the steering wheel. I didn't remember any crossroads like this from my childhood. Then again, it had been years, decades, even since I'd last been here. Maybe I'd forgotten, or maybe the road had changed, a new one paved since the last time I'd been back. I glanced at the GPS again, more out of habit than hope. Still nothing, just a blank screen. Great, I muttered under my breath, drumming my fingers on the wheel. The car idled quietly, the engine's hum the only sound in the stillness. I turned my head to look down each path, trying to make a decision. Neither looked particularly inviting, but something about sitting there, stationary and alone, felt wrong. The longer I lingered, the more the unease crept in. The air seemed colder, the silence more oppressive. My breath fogged up the window as I exhaled, my eyes darting nervously to the rearview mirror. I shook my head, trying to shake off the feeling. It was just a crossroads, nothing more. I'd probably laugh at myself later for how tense I was feeling, but right now all I could think about was getting out of there. I looked again at the two paths, my gaze settling on the one with better visibility. It wasn't much clearer, but I could see farther down it, and something about that made it feel safer. Take the clearer path, I thought to myself. Most people would. It was the logical choice. Besides, I was eager to get to the town. The thought of seeing those familiar streets, those old landmarks from my childhood, pushed aside the unease, replacing it with a flicker of excitement. Without giving it too much more thought, I turned the wheel toward the clearer road. As I started forward, the eerie feeling didn't go away. If anything, it seemed to grow stronger, like something unseen was watching me, waiting to see which path I'd take. I glanced back at the other road one last time, its foggy entrance fading into the trees. A strange shiver ran down my spine, but I ignored it. Just your imagination? I muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. Keep going. After a couple of minutes, I started to question my decision. The road wasn't what I remembered, or maybe it wasn't the same road at all. It had gone from smooth and steady to rough and cracked. Felt like it hadn't been driven on in years. The fog, already thick, grew heavier, wrapping itself around the car like a shroud. My headlights barely cut through it, illuminating just a few meters ahead. Everything beyond that was an endless void of swirling white and gray. No lights on the streets, no other cars, no signs of life, just me. And then the car began to act strange. It started with a faint whine, barely audible over the hum of the engine. I told myself it was nothing, just the strain of the old vehicle on the uneven road. But the sound grew louder, more insistent. It was an unsettling, high-pitched whirring, like something deep in the engine was spinning too fast, out of sync. The road felt endless, stretching out before me in a haze of fog and shadow. I strained my eyes, desperate to make out anything in the murky distance. Something to anchor myself to, something to prove I wasn't completely alone. But there was nothing. I whispered to myself, just keep going. You're almost there. Just keep going. But the farther I went, the more I started to wonder if I'd made a mistake. The road, the fog, the eerie sounds from the car. It all felt like it was leading me somewhere I wasn't meant to go. As I battled the rising fear, gripping the wheel tightly and praying for some sign of where I was, the car jerked again. The engine let out a guttural whine, and the fog outside seemed to close in even tighter, suffocating the road in a blanket of white. I couldn't see more than a few meters ahead, my headlights struggling against the oppressive mist. My mind was racing, filled with half-formed thoughts. What if I was lost? What if I'd taken a road that led nowhere? And then it happened. Out of nowhere, she appeared. An old woman, standing in the middle of the road. She wasn't walking or moving, just standing there, perfectly still, as if she'd been waiting for me. My heart leapt into my throat. The fog was so dense, I didn't see her until I was almost on top of her. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the cracked asphalt as the car skidded. My body lurched forward, the seatbelt digging into my chest. I stopped just in time. She was inches away from the hood of my car, illuminated in the weak glow of my headlights. She didn't flinch, didn't react at all, just stood there. Her clothes were ragged and dirty, hanging loosely from her frail frame. A faded shawl covered her head, but strands of gray, matted hair peeked out from beneath it. Her face was pale, almost ashen, and her eyes weren't looking at me. They were staring past me into the distance, as if she was seeing something I couldn't. For a moment, all I could do was sit there, my hands frozen on the wheel. My brain was scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. Who was she? What was she doing out here in the middle of nowhere in the dead of night? And why wasn't she moving? I rolled down the window, just a crack, and called out to her. "Ma'am, are you okay?" No response. She didn't even blink. The air felt heavier now, thicker. There was a strange smell seeping into the car, damp and metallic, like rust and wet earth. I called out again, louder this time. "Hey, do you need help? You're in the middle of the road." Still nothing. Her silence was deafening, oppressive. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe. And then, a loud noise from the back of the car. A deafening crash erupted behind me, shattering the fragile quiet of the night. It sounded like something had slammed against the back windshield, hard enough to make the entire car shudder. My heart nearly stopped. I froze, my hands gripping the steering wheel like a lifeline. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror, but all I could see was fog, thick, impenetrable, and unnervingly still. What was that? I leaned forward slightly, straining to peer into the rearview mirror again, but it was useless. The fog clung to the car like a living thing, making it impossible to see more than a few feet behind me. Panic clawed at the edges of my mind. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there, to drive away and not look back. But another part of me, the part that wanted to believe this was all just some bizarre misunderstanding, urged me to stay. I turned back to the old woman, ready to ask if she'd seen or heard anything, but she was gone. Just gone. One moment she was there, standing motionless in the glow of my headlights. The next, she had vanished into the fog, as if she'd never been there at all. I stared at the empty road in disbelief, my mind racing. Had I imagined her? Was my mind playing tricks on me? Or had she somehow slipped away into the mist without a sound? I rolled up the window, locked the doors, and gripped the wheel tightly, my eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. My gut told me to drive, to put as much distance between myself and this place as possible. But even as I pressed the accelerator, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. Everything about this night was wrong, and my mind was struggling to make sense of it. My heart was pounding, and I could still feel the lingering effects of what had happened with the old woman. Her sudden disappearance, the strange bang on my windshield, the unsettling silence that surrounded me. I knew I needed to get away from it all. Get out of this cursed stretch of road before whatever was happening here reached its breaking point. Without thinking, I pressed the gas pedal harder, determined to drive faster. But as I sped ahead, my eyes caught something. A figure standing further down the road, just ahead of the thick fog. Another woman. She was alone, and she was looking at me as if she had been waiting for me. I slowed down, despite my better judgment, and rolled down the window. Her face was pale, but her expression seemed normal. She looked relieved, almost too relieved. "I thought I was the only one out here," she said, her voice tinged with exhaustion but somehow calm. "Thank God I found somebody this late." I frowned, trying to shake the tension from my mind. "What are you doing out here all alone?" I asked, genuinely curious and trying to focus on something, anything that made sense. She smiled faintly and took a step closer, as if trusting me completely. "I'm just trying to get home," she explained. "I was out with my sister, and we stopped to clean the windshield. But my sister, she's not right in the head, you know?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure how to respond to that. "She wandered off again," she continued. "She tends to do that sometimes. I don't know where she went, and I'm really starting to get worried." Her eyes darted nervously as she looked up and down the road. "Could you help me find her?" she asked, almost pleading. "I'm sure she's just somewhere along this road. I just don't want her to get lost out here." There was a sense of urgency in her voice that tugged at me. "Sure," I said, my voice shaky. "I'll help. Don't worry, we'll find her." She seemed to relax at my response. Thanking me softly, she opened the passenger door and climbed into the car. We didn't waste any time. I turned the car around and drove back down the road, retracing the same path I had just taken. The fog was even thicker now, and it was hard to see more than a few feet in front of the car. The only sound was the low hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the wheels on the uneven road. After a few minutes, we reached the spot where I had seen the old woman, but there was no sign of her. The woman beside me shifted uncomfortably, glancing around. Her fingers tapped nervously on her lap. "She must have gone towards the car," she said quietly. "She always does that when she gets lost. She'll think it's safer to go back where we stopped." I nodded and turned the car around again, following the road back the way we had come. As we drove, she seemed to relax a bit, but there was still a hint of worry in her eyes. I could see the way she kept glancing around, as if expecting her sister to pop out from behind the thick fog at any moment. I couldn't help but feel the tension creeping back. Something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. As we drove further back, the woman turned to me, her voice softer now. "Oh, I forgot to introduce myself," she said, her smile still faint but genuine. "I am Linda Watson. Thank you again for helping me." I gave a tight smile in return, nodding as I kept my eyes on the road. "Of course, Linda. I'm happy to help," I said, though my voice lacked the usual conviction. The words felt hollow, as if something else was on the verge of happening. We were almost back to the spot where we had originally stopped. The road stretched out before us, covered in an endless sheet of fog, and the trees on either side seemed to loom closer with each passing second. The road felt too narrow, too enclosed. I slowed the car to a crawl as I scanned the area, trying to make out any sign of Linda's sister. But there was nothing except the deep, suffocating fog. Linda's gaze sharpened as she peered out the window, searching. "She's not here," I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. "She's gone." Linda didn't respond immediately. She just stared ahead, the quiet tension building in the car. "She must have gone toward where our car is parked," she murmured, her voice distant. "It's a little further ahead from here. We should check there as well." Felt like the only thing left to do. I kept driving ahead, unable to shake the feeling that we were not alone here. I didn't know what to expect anymore. The further I drove, the more I felt like I was sinking deeper into some kind of twisted dream, a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. Every mile seemed to stretch on forever, each turn bringing us closer to something unknown, something wrong. The fog was suffocating, and my mind raced with thoughts of what had happened. What was still happening? I tried to focus, to keep myself together, but every glance at Linda beside me sent a chill down my spine. There was something in her eyes, something too familiar, but I pushed the thought aside. We had to keep moving. As we continued down the road, I saw something. A structure looming in the distance, barely visible through the thick haze. An old house. It looked abandoned, like it had been left to rot for decades. The kind of place that seemed frozen in time, with peeling paint, broken windows, and a sagging roof. The kind of place you only see in stories, or when your mind conjures up images of forgotten places that were better off left in the past. There was no sign of a car, no sign of anyone else around. But then, at the edge of the property, I saw her. The older sister. She was standing there, motionless, a dark figure against the crumbling backdrop of the house. At first, I wasn't sure if it was really her. She looked different, like something was off. But as we got closer, I saw her more clearly. Linda immediately sat up straighter in her seat, her eyes locking on the figure. Without a word, she threw open the door, her feet slamming against the ground as she rushed out of the car, heading straight for her sister. I watched her run, her feet pounding on the gravel, until she reached the older woman. They embraced. Linda wrapped her arms around her sister, holding her tightly, and I could hear the soft, relieved sighs from both of them. It was like all the tension, all the fear had been released in that moment. For a brief moment, I felt a sense of relief too. They had found each other. Maybe everything would be okay. Maybe it was all just a misunderstanding, a crazy coincidence that would fade away in the light of day. But that relief, that sense of hope, didn't last long. Not even close, because as I sat in the car, watching them, a sinking feeling in my stomach grew heavier. I realized something. There was no car, no sign of where they had come from, no other footprints or tracks in the dirt around the house. I had been so focused on the chaos, on the strange occurrences, that I hadn't noticed the details. The little things that should have made me pause, should have made me question everything. The headlights of the car were the only source of light. Everything else was swallowed up by the thick fog, leaving the world around us in complete darkness. My eyes adjusted slowly, but the longer I stared, the stranger the scene became. I saw it, but it didn't make sense at first. The older sister, the one I had seen standing near the house, was barefoot. She had no shoes, I thought to myself, that's strange. But then again, she wasn't exactly in the right state of mind, was she? Her disheveled appearance could have explained it, I told myself. But then, as my eyes flicked over to Linda, I froze. She was barefoot too. She had no shoes. It hit me with a sudden clarity. I had failed to notice that earlier. In all the confusion, I hadn't even realized they were both standing there with nothing on their feet. My breath caught in my throat. How could I have missed that? As I tried to make sense of it, I glanced down at the ground, and that's when I saw it. A giant circle drawn directly on the dirt. The edges of the circle were jagged and uneven, as if it had been hurriedly scratched into the earth. Inside the circle were bizarre shapes, symbols, markings that looked alien, unintelligible, but unmistakably sinister. They seemed to pulse in the darkness, an unnatural presence emanating from them. Absolute chills ran down my spine. A cold sweat dripped down the back of my neck. Couldn't breathe. It was as if the world around me had come to a standstill, every muscle in my body frozen. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing down on me like an unseen weight. What was happening? Why hadn't I noticed before? Sometimes all it takes is one trigger, a single moment, a single detail that shifts everything. And as my mind processed the symbols, the bare feet, the eerie calmness of the sisters, I felt it. The undeniable truth began to take form. I wasn't standing in front of two lost women who simply needed help. No, this was something far worse. The weight of it crashed down on me with the force of a freight train. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get out of there. I was trapped in that moment, frozen by the terror that now gripped me. This wasn't just a random encounter. It was planned. It was something older, something dark. I slammed my foot on the gas, jerking the car into reverse, the tires screeching loudly against the gravel, echoing through the empty, fog-filled night. The car groaned in protest, but I didn't care, couldn't care. The only thing that mattered was getting as far away from that place as possible. As I sped backward, my eyes darted to front. Those two figures, the sisters, they were running towards me. Their movements were frantic, desperate, and filled with something I couldn't quite understand. They were yelling, "Please stop. Don't abandon us like the others. Please, save us. We've been trapped for decades." The words hit me like a slap to the face, but there was no time to process them. No time to think. The only thing I knew in that moment was that I couldn't stay there any longer. I was in pure survival mode now. Instinct had completely taken over. There was nothing else, nothing in my mind but the overwhelming urge to escape. The tires screamed again as I swung the wheel, finally steering the car in the opposite direction, away from the sisters and that terrifying symbol on the ground. The fog around me swirled, thick and suffocating, but I could still hear their voices. They were getting closer. "Please, we need you." But I couldn't stop, couldn't look back. The sisters' voices, those frantic, desperate pleas, still echoed in my ears. "Please, don't leave us. We need you." They were still calling out to me, but I couldn't let myself fall into the trap of believing they were real. No, I had to get away. I had to make it out. I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see them, the sisters, chasing after me, their faces twisted with sorrow and fear. But when I looked, there was nothing, no sign of them. Relief washed over me for a split second, but it was short-lived. Out of nowhere, a loud sound startled me. A deafening noise from above, as if something had slammed into the roof of the car. The sound was sharp and horrifying, followed by a series of scratches, like nails raking against metal. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, the car jerking under the impact, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. I looked up in the mirror again, and there was no sign of anyone. Nothing. The fog pressed against the windows, blurring my vision, but I knew what I had just heard. I wasn't imagining it. Something was up there. Panic surged through my veins. The voice in my head screamed, "This is it. This is how it ends." Whatever was chasing me, whatever had been haunting me on that road, it was here. I wasn't going to make it out of this. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white, the sound of scratching growing louder, more frantic. It was as if something or someone was trying to tear through the roof, desperate to reach me. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. I could feel the fear rising, suffocating me. It wasn't just the sound, it was the feeling that whatever was out there, whatever had been calling me, was now so close I could almost touch it. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just an animal, something moving on the roof. But that was a lie, a weak excuse. Nothing on earth could create that kind of sound. Nothing could make the roof scratch and groan the way it did. I knew, whatever it wasn't human. It wasn't real. But it was here and it wanted me. My vision blurred as the car roared forward, and for a moment, I thought I was losing myself completely. The fog seemed alive, wrapping around the car like it was trying to pull me back. The rhythmic pounding on the roof was deafening, and every instinct told me I wouldn't make it out of this nightmare. But then, it all stopped. The scratching, the pounding, gone in an instant. The fog began to thin, and the cold, oppressive air gave way to something warmer, almost inviting. The haze in my mind started to clear, and before I knew it, I was on a road I recognized. Not the intersection where I'd made that fateful turn, but further ahead, closer to the town. I slowed the car, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. This was a stretch of road I knew well. It was familiar, comforting, even like it had been waiting for me all along. The sight of the old wooden fences and the distant glow of town lights was almost surreal. Had I imagined it all? The sisters, the house, the circle on the ground, the pounding on the roof? My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. Something that I had left behind, or worse, something that had come with me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see them standing in the road behind me. But the mirror showed nothing, just the long, empty stretch of asphalt disappearing into the darkness. For the first time in what felt like hours, I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. The warmth of the air was almost too perfect, as if it was trying to soothe me, to make me forget. But how could I forget? How could anyone forget something like that? As I approached the edge of the town, the faint glow of the streetlights brought a strange mix of relief and unease. The town looked the same as I remembered it, yet it didn't feel the same. The comforting nostalgia I'd been chasing all day had been replaced by something darker, something that whispered to me from the shadows of my memory. I leaned back in the seat, trying to calm myself, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. Bits and pieces of old stories came flooding back, those strange tales whispered in hushed tones by the adults when they thought the kids weren't listening. There was the story of the farmer who took his own life, claiming the voices in his head wouldn't leave him alone. He said his soul was being tormented, his every waking moment a nightmare. And then, there was the story of a family. I remembered it now, vaguely, but enough to make my stomach churn. A family from the outskirts of town, known for their strange ways. People said they had ties to something dark, a cult. The whispers around town were that they'd tried summoning something they couldn't control. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to focus. The details were fuzzy, but I remembered hearing how the family's two daughters, their teenage daughters, had gone missing. Theories had run wild. Some said they'd run away. Others believed they'd been sacrificed. The one thing everyone agreed on was that the family was cursed. Then, like a bolt of lightning, it hit me. I slammed my hand against the steering wheel, the realization making my blood run cold. The sisters, I muttered under my breath. My heart pounded as the pieces clicked together, the stories from my childhood merging with the nightmare I just escaped. The sisters, the two girls who had vanished. People used to say their spirits still wandered, lost and seeking vengeance or salvation. And then their name came rushing back, as clear as if someone had whispered it into my ear. Watson. Oh my God. I breathed, my voice trembling. The Watson sisters. The fog, the house, the circle. It all started to make sense in the most horrifying way possible. And then I whispered the name that had been burned into the town's history, the name I had heard the younger ones say. Linda Watson. My hands trembled on the wheel, the weight of the truth crashing down on me. I hadn't just stumbled onto some eerie stretch of road. I'd crossed into something far darker, something the town had tried to forget. The fluorescent lights of the gas station came into view, flickering faintly in the distance, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I let out a shaky breath. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly they ached, but I didn't dare let go until I was safely parked under the glow of those lights. I needed to feel anchored to something real. I pulled in, killed the engine, and just sat there for a moment, staring ahead. My chest was heaving, my heart pounding like it was trying to escape. I felt like a man who had just crawled out of his own grave. The world felt strange, like I wasn't supposed to be here. I stepped out of the car on shaky legs, the cool night air brushing against my face. I must have looked like hell, sweat-soaked, wide-eyed, and breathing like I'd run a marathon. A man in a faded uniform walked out from the gas station, his name tag glinting under the lights. Joe. He gave me a once-over, his eyebrows furrowing. Hey, buddy, you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost, he said, a nervous chuckle escaping his lips. I tried to answer, but the words tumbled out of me in a mess of fragments. The road. There was this diversion sisters, a house. Joe's face froze, the casual concern draining away in an instant. His eyes narrowed as he stepped closer. Wait, what did you just say? The sisters, I croaked. One got in my car, said her name was Linda Watson. Her sister, the house, the circle. My voice cracked. Joe took a step back, his face pale as if I'd slapped him. His mouth opened and closed like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Finally, he muttered, almost to himself, "Oh my God, you got pulled in by the sisters." The way he said it made my blood run cold. What are you talking about? I demanded, though my voice was barely above a whisper. He looked at me like I was a dead man who'd somehow clawed his way back to life. You're lucky, man. You don't even know how lucky. People who take that road, sometimes they don't come back. Those sisters, they've been doing this for years, decades maybe. They pull people in. Most don't get out. I stared at him, my breath catching in my throat. What do you mean, pull people in? Joe rubbed the back of his neck, looking away like he didn't want to say it out loud. The Watson sisters. Yeah, they went missing a long time ago, but they didn't just disappear. Their family, well, let's just say they were into some real dark stuff. Whatever they were trying to do, it backfired. Now the sisters are stuck, trapped in that place, and they're always looking for someone to take their spot. I felt the world tilt beneath me. Take their spot. I whispered, the words barely audible. Joe nodded grimly. You're one lucky guy. If you hadn't stepped on that gas when you did. He trailed off, shaking his head like he didn't even want to finish the thought. I didn't say another word. What could I say? I climbed back into my car, my hands still trembling. Joe stood there watching me, his face a mix of pity and relief, like he couldn't believe I'd made it out alive. As I drove away, the gas station lights faded into the rearview mirror, replaced by the familiar stretch of highway I knew so well. But it didn't feel familiar anymore. Nothing did. The warmth of the night air, the hum of my engine. They were real, tangible, but I couldn't shake the feeling that part of me was still on that cursed road, back in that fog, staring at the sisters. I don't know how long I drove before I finally pulled into town, the comforting glow of streetlights guiding me home. I parked in my driveway, shut off the engine, and sat there in silence for a long time, trying to convince myself that it was over. But it's not over. Not really. I can still hear their voices sometimes, faint and distant, begging me to stop, to turn around, to help them. I can still see the house, the circle, the look in their eyes. I'll never take that road again. I'll never even think about it. But the memory of that night, it's mine to carry now, a shadow that will follow me for the rest of my life. Some stories aren't meant to be told. Some stories you take to the grave.